Hello and welcome back. This is part two of my conversation with parts unknown comic book store owner John Hitchcock and the person who brought us together, Mr. Matt B. Lloyd. We started out last time hearing a bit about their introduction. Now, John has even more stories to share. Enjoy another installation of this great series coming to you all week long as part of Will Eisner Week.
And Eisner starts laughing. I mean, he is like falling out. And he's going, yeah, I'm always hitting up for. And Archie, so we turn around to leave. And Archie Goodwin grabs me by my arm and pulls me aside. And he goes, damn it, John. You know what you just did? You just insulted Will Eisner. You just insulted him. I can't believe you would say that shit. I mean, and he's mad. I mean, he's angry that I said, look, one thing I've learned, man, is these guys want to have a good time. They want to have a laugh. They're regular guys. They just happen to be incredibly good at what they do, and they like to have a good time. And Eisner's one of those guys that likes to cut up and have a good time. I mean, and that's just the way it is. And we had breakfast that next morning, and he was fantastic. He answered everybody's questions. He signed everybody's autographs at the table. Like Mr. Eisner. Yeah, any friend of John's a friend of mine. He'd sign them, and he was just such a down to earth guy. And then every year at San Diego we would see each other. And then it was so interesting because he would walk up to me in the middle of San Diego. I'd see him walk by and he'd go, "Hey, John, have you seen Frank Miller?" And I was like, I've never met Frank Miller. And he goes, "Well, if you see Frank Miller, you tell him I'm looking for him." "Okay, I'll be glad to." And he'd just take off. So he'd do that stuff all the time. He said, "You made that Michael Clairon guy?" I said, no. He goes, "Well, if you see him, tell him I'm looking for him. I got to talk to him. I got to go over to him and take off." And it happened but we'd always get together and he would say, "I'm doing a signing at Kitchen Sink at 2:00. Can you meet me at the table at 2:00 and we'll go out and get something to eat or get some drinks or something?" I was like, "Hey, great." So I had a watch, go over, and I'd meet him there. And he would go, "Come on, John, let's go out here." So we went out, and this is the other story I told at the memorial. And we walked out, and he goes, "Hey, John, what do you drink?" I said, "Well, I drink diet drinks." And so he goes up to this little push cart thing they had, and he goes, "That's what I drink." And he goes, "Young lady, give me a Diet Coke, 2 straws." And I'm like, "Okay." And I was like, well, I'm thinking to myself, well, he maybe he's cheap. I don't know. But and so I'm like, okay. And so I said, "Do you want to hold the drink?" And he goes, "No, you can hold the drink." And so we got 2 straws in this thing, and we're drinking out of it. And I'm thinking, what's the worst case scenario? He slobbers in the drink, and I get some of that shit, that genius shit. I mean, I'm thinking this could be this might help me throughout my life. But was Will Eisner testing me, and to see if I would drink out of after a Jew. I mean, you know what I mean. You don't know, and so we're sitting there swapping this drink back and forth, talking about comics and what's going on and shit, and everything's really cool. And then these 2 guys come walking by, and I know them, and they walk by one side, and they walk by the other side, and they walk back, and they turn looking at me. "Are we seeing what we're really seeing?" And I went, "Yeah." I said, "Just for historical reference, John Hitchcock, Will Eisner, Diet Coke, 2 straws." And Eisner's laughing, and he goes, "Just remember, young men, historical accuracy is very important when reporting these stories." And we all fell out laughing. Of course, they all wanted a couple of autographs. And then we could, they took off. And I said, "Will, you've done a lot of marvelous things in your life. Some really, I mean, just stuff that's going to live forever." And he goes, "Well, gee, thanks, John." I said, "But when you can get a half-assed Presbyterian and a Jew to split a drink, you've done your part for world peace, brother." And he just screaming, laughing. And he said, "John, I got to go." I said, "You want the drink?" And he goes, "No, you finish it. I got a panel to go to." And he sprinted away because he was late for a panel. And because he was he played tennis all the time. He was in incredible shape his whole life until the very end, when he had that surgery on his hip, I think it was, and he got infected and never came back out. But he was just the most down to earth, nicest guy. And, in every profession, it doesn't matter if it's acting or music or whatever, comics are the same way. There are certain guys that are the best, the cream that goes to the top. And in my opinion, Will Eisner is that guy. Because not only was he a grandmaster storyteller and artist, but he was also a very astute businessman. He was evidently a millionaire by 1950. He did everything. He thought different ways than the normal person. And, he went to the military, worked at the Pentagon, worked on PS Magazine. This is after the Spirit, 12 years on the Spirit. And he goes ahead and he does PS Magazine for a long time because he convinced the government that you can visually show a comic book story, and the soldiers would retain more information if they visually saw it than if they read it. And he proved that to them. And he had that gig for a long time. And then he got out of that. It was turned over. Murphy Anderson did it for a while. And then Joe Kubert School did it for a while. I don't know if it's still around. Maybe it is. And then that's when he went to that New York convention where he met Dennis Kitchen. And he was basically saw what the underground people were doing. Supposedly he was kind of turned off by the over sexual references and stuff of the material. But later he started thinking about it and he goes, if these guys can do this, if Robert Crumb and Sheridan and Irons and Corbin and those guys can do this and they can make money, it's a profitable thing, then maybe that's where I need to go. And that's when he spent the next year doing Contract with God, which wasn't the first graphic novel, but it was the graphic novel that popularized the graphic novel form. And when you walk around my store, there are thousands and thousands of testaments to his dedication because I've got walls of stuff. And I consider graphic novel technically is material that's first published in a trade paperback or a hardcover. I don't consider trade paperbacks that are collected comics that are jammed, put together, and I don't consider them graphic novels. I consider them trade paperbacks. Graphic novel is new material published specifically for that format.
So just to differentiate, like Watchmen is still just a collection.
It's still a collection of comics. It's not really a graphic novel. But it was done to be that way.
Yeah, it was
because
written that way.
It reads that way. But he was the nicest guy. And the other thing was, after I spoke at his memorial, and it was over, I heard his wife Annie yelling, John, come over here. And I went over to see her, and she said, John, thank you so much for standing up and telling those stories, because you're the one guy who, out of all those people on that panel, really understood exactly what he was all about. And then she gave me a kiss, and she thanked me for being there. And I looked at her and I said, I'm going to remember him for the rest of my life. I'm going to think about him all the time, because he really was one of those nice guys, and he considered himself an ambassador to for the comic field. He would go to New Zealand. He'd go to Australia. He'd go to Spain. He'd go South America. He went and he promoted comics and he promoted graphic novels. And he didn't just promote his work. He promoted it as a whole. And that's another thing that people should remember is how much work, he was tireless. He was tireless, And when you talk about the five greatest comic book artists that ever lived, Eisner's, in my opinion, is number one. Then Jack Kirby, then Harvey Kurtzman, then Wally Wood, and in my opinion, Alex Toth. Those are the five greatest. And then if you go to the next batch, you got to mention Al Williamson and Joe Kubert and Graham Ingalls and Jack Cole from Plastic Man. There's others. But those five guys, if you want to know anything about comics, you study those five guys and everything else will open up for you. Everything. Because their work is just so far above so much, almost everything else. Because and those guys, Eisner was an exception. He got to own the Spirit. Imagine that, 1940, cuts a deal, and he has ownership of that character, and now his family will have ownership of that character forever. It'll stay in his family. And he knew what he was doing. He respected it. Milton Caniff dropped out of Terry and the Pirates, did Steve Canyon 1946.
Yeah.
Eisner was 6 years ahead of him.
Yeah.
And made sure he owned the property. He thought in terms of that, and he found value in his work and value in his property.
That's so far ahead of his time. I mean, of the time to
It's
think
incredible.
that, because that's not something that really happened. Even though doing like a newspaper strip was the deal back then, if you did that, you made it.
Mm-hmm.
And then to create your own, but then to own it, that was a whole new ballgame. To think that he knew that would.
He thought in terms of that. He thought in terms of it as property, as a viable property.
An intellectual property, like we say today. But I mean, it was also a bit of a risk too, because what he was presenting wasn't a standard newspaper strip either. It was something entirely different.
It was like a 16-page coverless comic, 16 pages with the Spirit story first, and then Lady Luck and Mr. Mystic in the back, 2 short stories, and he had to do that 16-pager had to be done every week, 52 days, 52
weeks a year,
Sundays.
Yeah.
And he always told everybody, and he makes a joke out of it, but he wasn't hired because he was a genius. He was hired because he was fast, and they knew he could get it done. And he wasn't joking about it. He was telling the truth.
Well, all the stuff he did before that with Eisner and Iger shop, all the packaging in the very early days, he did tons. I mean, it's incredible how much stuff he created and did in those early days.
Well, in I think his first published work was 1936, and I always thought the first thing he did was in Jumbo Comics 1, but it turns out he did do some stuff for a comic book called Wags that was shipped overseas. It was kind of a weird formatted, coverless book comic. I saw a couple of them up at Al Williamson's house and couldn't believe the format. It was pretty big and pretty odd shaped thing.
Was that the Hawks at the Sea?
There was a book called The Hawk. But Hawks of the Sea originally was done as a newspaper Sunday strip.
Yeah.
That was basically cut up and pasted down, and then more art added to put it into the comic format. Because if they would have published it as a Sunday in a comic book, it would be too small. You wouldn't be able to read it all the way.
Did that actually ever make it in the papers somewhere? I don't remember. I
don't think it did. I think it was something that was turned down.
It was something he created and was working on.
Well, he decided to open up his own studio. And he got Jerry Iger to be the business end of it, because Iger was older than him and because he was only 19.
Yeah.
And the famous story is he had $1.90 in his pocket and rented a room borrowed $15 from his father and rented a room for $15 in New York to be his studio. And he basically drew and wrote everything and became a packager for Fiction House. And of course, and also Quality, which was Jumbo Comics.
Fiction House was Jumbo. Sheena.
Was it?
Yeah.
Well, Sheena, he created Sheena. He was one of the creators. Black Hawk. He did a lot of things. But if you start thinking about it, you're going, he drew in 5 different styles because he was trying to convince the people that were buying it that he had a whole stable of artists. So he drew in a cartoony Bigfoot style. He drew in a serious style. He drew a more illustrative style. He drew it, and then he would sign it different names. Spencer Steele, William Renaissy. I mean, he signed it in different names because he was trying to convince these people that they had this big group, and they didn't. They just had him at a drawing table working his ass off. And you remember, this generation came through the Depression, and to have a job, any job, was a big deal. But, I mean, a lot of these guys, they were making more money than their father in the first couple of months they worked in comic book business. I mean, that's big.